Hi there, everybody. My name is Ryan Rakshan, and I'm one of the three people behind Midnight Ceramics. And today I'm going to be shooting an instructional video on how to use crawl glazes. Crawl glazes are really, really cool, and you can use them to get some incredibly interesting effects. But all of those effects are mostly happening, well, I shouldn't say all, about half of what's contributing to that effect is all in the application, right? So I have to set up the chemistry for that application to work well, but if you don't apply the glaze well, you're not going to get a good crawl application on your pot. So because of some of those effects where like the crawl glazes tend to be reticulated, the glazes aren't food safe, but they are really cool. And we just think that they kind of go along with our aesthetic here at Midnight. I have a 2-quart container of crawl glaze that I just mixed up today. And when we are selling you all crawl glazes, we'll be selling them in 1-gallon containers, so you'll be getting about twice what I have here. And just real briefly, the way that crawl glazes work, crawling happens, so like people see crawling on pots all the time. It's when you're applying a glaze to a pot, you put it in the kiln and it comes back out and it's got like a bare patch somewhere on the pot. That happens because of crawling, and that's usually an application issue. And normally what's happening is clay shrinks as it dries, and all glazes have a little bit of clay. So as the water leaves the glaze and goes into the pot, when you apply the glaze to the pot, that glaze shrinks just a little bit. And as it's shrinking, sometimes it causes a little teeny tiny crack in the surface of the glaze. And later on, if that glaze has a high surface tension, when it's molten, that crack will peel apart and you'll get a bare spot. Now, crawl glazes are specifically designed with two things in mind. They're designed to shrink massively when you put them on your pot. So there's lots and lots of water in them, and there's a very high clay content. And as that water leaves the glaze and goes into the pot, all of that clay that's in the glaze shrinks a whole lot. And then the second thing that they're designed for is high surface tension in the kiln. So surface tension is like when you're driving through like a rainstorm and you've just recently had your car cleaned and they put some Rain-X on your windshield and the water beads up really tight. That water's got a higher surface tension because the Rain-X is kind of repelling it. And so we're designing this glaze so that when it goes into the kiln, as it starts to melt and become molten, it has a high surface tension and wants to bead up. So I have a pot sitting on top of a kiln over here, kind of drying out. I just lined it with Canadian Tuxedo because I think that this white crawl glaze is going to look pretty cool on a Canadian Tuxedo liner glaze, right? So the outside of this pot I'm going to apply a crawl glaze to, and the inside has already been glazed in Canadian Tuxedo. Now, because of that mechanism I was just talking about, where the water has to leave the glaze and go into the pot, it's important that after you put your liner glaze on the inside of your pot, you wait at least about 24 hours to dry that pot out. You want all of the water to leave the wall of that pot and kind of evaporate out into the atmosphere. You may have noticed that when you paint your pots with glazes or when you dip your pots in glazes, they look like they dry almost immediately, right? It takes like 30 seconds for your pots to dry a lot of the time. And that's not actually the water evaporating out into the air. What that effect is that's the water being soaked into the wall of the pot. So we want the wall of the pot to be, we don't want it to have any water. We want it to be completely dry. So after I lined this pot, I sat it on top of the kiln. It's been on the kiln for about an hour, heating up and drying out. And it still feels a little bit heavy, like it's got a little bit of water in it, but it should work for this particular demonstration. So next we're going to mix up our crawl glaze here. Some studios will use little like wooden sticks to mix up their glazes. I personally don't think that those really do the best job. Whisk also isn't the best thing to use. My personal favorite thing is toilet bowl brush, because you can get way down in the corners of the container and really mix stuff up pretty well. But I don't have a toilet bowl brush that's small enough for this container, so I use a whisk. And that works pretty well. If you have like a hand blender that you want to dip into something, that works pretty well too. So next I've got my sponge handy so I can wipe off the bottom of my pot. I didn't even bother waxing it because the wax doesn't really work too well with the crawl glaze. It still tends to stick to the pot. And I'm just going to go ahead and dunk this pretty quickly down into my glaze. Ooh, I didn't plan that out very well. That's okay. There we go. And then as soon as I get it out, I am going to wipe my bottom. Now I'm going to bring the camera in close, and I'm going to take a time lapse of this glaze drying on the surface of this pot. And you guys are going to get to see something really cool as this glaze dries. Alrighty everybody, welcome back. It's been about maybe 2 hours since I dipped this pot, and we got to see a little bit of a time lapse while the glaze was drying on the surface of the pot. And so what you've probably noticed is that these cracks kind of slowly formed in the surface of the glaze. And on most glazes we would say, oh, that's a bad thing, we don't want that to happen. But these are actually the starts of little tiny crawls beginning to happen. And we'll get to see what this looks like when it comes out of the kiln. I think that this is going to have pretty reasonable crawling, especially down here where there's lots of cracks. Up here in this sort of area, we might not get many crawls. It might just be kind of a flat white glaze, but we'll see what that looks like. There are a couple last important things that I need to tell you all about how to deal with this glaze. This glaze is really fragile on the surface of the pot. So up here where the glaze overlapped with the Canadian tuxedo a little bit, I'm just going to grab a knife real quick, and I'm going to kind of show you all. It's really, really easy to scrape this off. It just kind of falls right off of the pot like that, right? So you have to be incredibly careful when you're moving these pots around after they've been glazed. So normally I'll try to have some way to pick up my pot kind of like this when I'm done glazing it, right? I don't want to grab it from the outside, because just the act of touching the glaze on the outside, all of these little kind of icebergs of glaze might pop off of the pot. The other thing, that can also happen in the kiln if you're not careful, right? And it can be really bad if you've got your pot right up next to the wall of your kiln and all these little flakes pop off and fall onto the wall of your kiln. The one positive thing is that they pop right off of kiln wash really easily. So if one of these little icebergs kind of falls off in the kiln, and it lands on some kiln wash on a kiln shelf, after the firing they just pop right off real easy. The glaze doesn't melt enough that it's going to get down into the kiln wash because of that really high surface tension. It kind of floats up on the top. But I can't say the same about your elements. It's not really good to get this glaze on your elements. So for that reason, I don't really suggest this glaze for community studios. Like, I have been a tech at a lot of different community studios, and I have loaded a lot of pots. And when you're loading, however many hundreds of pots a day, it can be kind of annoying when you get to the shelf and you find this thing that you have to treat really carefully and very specially. If you're at a smaller community studio, or if you've got just a really awesome tech who is really happy to, take some extra time to load your pot very, very carefully, definitely talk to your tech before they load this pot into your kiln or into their kiln. Or better yet, if you have a home kiln or a home studio, or if you're able to load your own kiln, that would probably be best in this situation. Then again, your tech might be really interested in crawl glazes and really be interested in learning about this sort of thing. So this pot's been glazed and it's ready to go. I'm going to go ahead and pick it up from the inside here, and I'm going to load it into the kiln, and I'll bring it back when we've got it fired, and we'll talk about it then. Alrighty everybody, so it's been about a week since we fired this pot, and as you can see, it worked kind of just like I expected, where down where we had all of those cracks before, there's lots and lots of crawling happening where the glaze is kind of peeling away from itself. And then up here where we didn't have quite so many cracks, the glaze is still doing a little kind of cool crawl thing here, but it's not quite exactly the same. One thing that I will say is that this glaze does look a lot better if you can get it on a darker clay body. So if you can get some really high contrast between the clay body itself and the glaze, this glaze can be really, really cool. That being said, it does still look pretty good on this pot. I'm pretty happy with this. So that's kind of all I've got to tell you all about that. Basically, just be really careful when you're applying Make sure that your pots are totally dry before you apply this glaze. You don't want to have any water in the pores of your pots before you apply the glaze. Be really careful as the glaze dries not to touch the outside of the pot where the glaze is applied to. And lastly, this glaze probably isn't food safe. Hopefully, that's pretty obvious. You'd get all kinds of food and nastiness trapped down into all the little crawls. So, anyways, hopefully this was informative for you all, and hopefully you'll decide to go to our website and pick up a gallon of crawl glaze and post your results on Instagram. You can tag us at Midnight Ceramics, and we almost always share your images on our stories. So have a good one. Talk to y'all soon.